up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, where since the year of 2008, we've been bringing you audiological goodness. That's right, podcast episodes, bringing all the nerdy hype right into your earbuds. Be they theologians, biblical scholars, philosophers, scientists, and longtime friend and spiritual creative, Mark Scandrette. That's right, Mark Scandrette is back on the podcast. And if you are one of our newer listeners here at Homebrew, this may be your first time you get to meet him, so don't worry. We give some background, some story, all the kind of intro-y things to get to know a person. We talk about that at the beginning of the episode before getting into his brand new book, The Ninefold Path of Jesus, Hidden Wisdom of the Beatitudes. Now, this is his 6th book, and they're all kind of practical spiritual formation type text. And they're piloted, the concepts, in a whole bunch of groups that he facilitates at his home in San Francisco and then across the globe. And you'll hear more about this, but Mark and I have been friends for a long time. We met as part of the kind of emerging church movement, have stayed in touch. Our families have hung out. He's guest spoke with his wife, Lisa, facilitated retreats at churches I worked at. So we're very good friends, and I just am so excited to let you all get to know Mark, if you're new. And for those of you that already know him, enjoy. This is a blast. Now, before we jump in to this episode, I want to let you all know that the next Homebrewed Christianity reading group is called Upsetting the Powers. That's right. Adam Clark is coming back, the one that helped facilitate the Black Theology reading group last year. We are going to be doing a new class called Upsetting the Powers, exploring the legacy of James Cone, the father of Black theology. That's right. If you go to jamesconewasright.com, you can join up, sign up. That's right, James Cone. And he is the one who said, racism is a profound contradiction of the gospel. No one can be a representative of Jesus and treat others as subhuman. There can be no compromise at this point. Any theology that does not fight white supremacy with all its intellectual strength cancels its Christian identity. That's James Cone. And in this class, we're going to be exploring his legacy, why theology matters, the emergence of Black theology, the movement historically from Black Power to Black Lives Matter, how you see Christ from the underside, how womanist theology emerges in his students, and how James Cone gives us a kind of model to engage other religious traditions. And we're going to be joined by a bunch of other people, special guests like Robert Ellsberg, Andrea White, Gary Dorian, Serene Jones, Kelly Brown Douglas. That's right. It is going to be awesome. And it's kicking off in January, the middle of January. You know, after the new year gets going, when the semester starts going, if you're, in school and that schedule flows with you, if you're a minister after Christmas and you've taken a break and you're planning out the next year, that's when we'll be starting this group. But you can join up now. Go to jamesconewasright.com. It'll be 6 weeks. It's open online class, and it's donation based. So you can give $0 or $1 million or anything in between. Tell your friends, go to jamesconewasright.com. Adam Clark and I will be reading through some amazing text, wrestling with them, and getting to visits from a host of special guests and interacting. And last time we had 2,500 people join us in our Black Theology reading group. So if you're in that, sign up, join again. It's going to be fun. Tell your friends. And with that, get ready. Here comes my buddy Mark Scandrette. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and today, returning to the podcast for his 5th visit, is Mark Scandrette, author of a brand new book, The Ninefold Path of Jesus, Hidden Wisdom of the Beatitudes. So, Mark, it's been a while since you've been on the podcast, because I tend to like to record them when I'm with you in person. And It's just something about not being in California. I don't see you as often.
I know.
Have you survived?
I'm still here. Okay. And it's great to be with you, Trippy.
Well, before I get into the book, I've had you probably have noticed this. There's like a whole new generation of people that discovered that deconstruction was a thing.
Oh yeah, I've seen the same thing.
And then they have their Instagram accounts because that's what's cool now. We didn't have those. And occasionally they'll like find the podcast, then go back and listen to all these old episodes. And I got sent a funny email the other day from a 23-ish-year-old in Texas who was going to some Acts 29 church plant or some thing, left because he got in trouble. And then that whole Mark Driscoll thing on Christianity Today's podcast thing's going on. And so he's like checking stuff down. He's listening to old podcasts, one of them that you're on it. And he's like, I'm pretty sure I remember Mark Driscoll complaining about Mark Scandrette.
Wow.
And there's a YouTube video about it that he sent me. And he's like, but I listened to him and he's like, I mean, I know some of those emergent guys said some stuff that's really, really out there, if you were conservative, but you talked to Mark a whole bunch of times. I kind of just think he took Jesus really seriously in San Francisco. Am I missing something? So I thought that's the perfect setup for you to tell us a bit about your story, because I think a lot of people, this will be the first time they get to meet you on the podcast.
Because we're OG deconstructionists.
Yeah, OG. That just means we're old now.
Well, you're not as old as I am, but you're older than you once were.
I'm a geriatric millennial. That's what I'm going for. Okay, so but for people that haven't met you before and this may be their first time interacting with you, you're writing here a book on the Beatitudes, but your story of kind of taking the way of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, a community after Jesus seriously has been so much of your life work. And that was kind of the context for you coming out of your faith. So like, where did taking the teachings with a community seriously first emerge as the path of deconstruction kind of thing?
Yeah, well, it was, I moved to San Francisco in 1998 to start a new kind of community that would be one I would like to belong to, a new kind of faith community. And pretty much everyone that I met said, Jesus is cool, but you Christians have effed with Jesus. And it was humbling and and factual. A lot of things have been done in the name of Jesus that are not like his being or character. And we kept trying to gather people together to start this community, but everyone had toxic experiences with church and with certain ideas associated with Western Christianity. And we could not get beyond the sadness and malaise and depression of that kind of deconstructive phase. And back in the day, all it would take would be one in a room of 20 people, one person who is in that critical stage of deconstruction to pull everybody else into the black hole who is beginning to reconstruct some kind of path. And so around that time, I thought, well, I still think there's something compelling about the person of Jesus and the wisdom of what he said about reality. And my Christian experience has been pretty much Pauline and ignoring most of what Jesus said or did. The only thing that was important is that he was born and that he died and came back to life. Anything that he ever did or said, it wasn't so important to the communities that I came up in. But it was
Mark, it was important that he never cursed or masturbated. Those are just they hadn't invented the cinema yet to go to our movies, but
Thanks for clarifying that.
I don't. I didn't want anyone to think you were backsliding already in the story.
So, my big wake up to life was reading the red letters of Jesus, and I revisited that experience in my mid-20s and thought that's when faith made sense to me, was knowing the wisdom of those things and trying them out. And so we just started getting people together and saying, let's look at some of these counter cultural things that Jesus said and did, and let's try to do some of them. It's a bit of cultural appropriation now, but at the time it seemed right. We called it the Jesus Dojo, which means place of the way. And I would connect it to like maybe some of the educational ideas of bell hooks and Paulo Freire. Like, let's together interrogate our situation and the narratives we're living under, look to wisdom sources, and do an experiment to try on a new way, and observe and reflect on what that does to our interior and to our connections with one another. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I've been trying to do that now for about 15 years, 16 years.
And that meant, moving into San Francisco and then working on building a community of practice and such. And I wonder if you think exactly how that may change if you were trying to do something similar today. Because a little bit ago, when our mutual friend Tony Jones and I were talking about it, we realized we were thinking, like, what would have happened if the whole emergent village and all the communities that were connected and part of that took place when social media was as big as it is now? Like, I would have been checking people's Instagram and not wanting to go to the cohort because I saw some memes they posted. And sometimes all that frustration that you were talking about, right? Like, where like, I know what we're doing is not working. This is ugly. And then there all this harm and stuff, and you can get hooked up on the criticism. Like, all those things that, if they're in a community, can get harnessed in practices that are life-giving and really creating new space. But I feel like so many of our outlets now just level up the cynicism, level up the kind of the emotional vomiting, right? Like, not because there is sharing emotions that's really hurtful and painful and vulnerable, that's generative and stuff, but where we get hung up, it's like, why start a community when you can have a meme account kind of thing?
Yeah.
Like what kind of wisdom did you have for people that are just now starting to wrestle with leaving that behind, in ways that our energy doesn't get poured into something that doesn't ultimately like give the gift that I think you're trying to describe in the new book?
I mean, I think
free.
I think relationships are important to this, like face-to-face, voice-to-voice, actual interactions where you notice facial expressions, mirror emotion. I think that's a lot more life-giving than sort of the anonymous post or tweet. And if I have a little bit of an annoyance, it's that the last few years, almost everywhere I go for a live event, someone comes up to me afterwards and it's like, have you listened to this podcast, or have you heard of so-and-so? And I'm like, I thought we just had an experience together. Can we be, you and I, here sharing authentically, rather than you just downloading on me ideas that you've heard from somebody else, or someone that you perceive to have influence or fame. And I understand sometimes you just don't know what to say. And I've probably done the same thing, where in the presence of somebody I admire or thought I could learn from, I tripped over my words and it's like, hey, have you ever heard of so-and-so? But I think there could also be something deeper there of like, we've maybe lost our ability to engage in real time and presence with one another. And I think that's part of the key to transformation is that encounter.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's a couple elements and stuff like that at play, because we have more with each generation, the percentage of people that identify with the institutions that they were born in, be it their denomination or church community or whatever, but also same's true for political parties and such. But like, as there's not the inherited kind of communities that you reference and go, oh, I'm part of that, right? Like, I'm at the Methodist church. Then you can have an encounter with someone. But if you would think religion's one of those things that gets toxic stuff done and hurts people, then you want to know, like, what's like the Venn diagram of things I trust because I've spent time with it, and are you connected to it? That's somehow how I hear those questions, where they're like, Mark, I really liked what was going on. Have you heard, or do you know? And what they really want to know is, like, what I experienced in this encounter resonates deeply with me, and I want to know if I can trust it, because I also had these other places. But there's not like physical communities in most cities where you can get together. And I think that like, it's like there's not an algorithm like there is for dating that helps you narrow things down when it goes to spiritual seeking. And it's just really hard. And I have a lot of degrees, and so I just have student loans to demonstrate my ability to siphon through things. But I do think it's like really hard without background structures to figure out, like, why do I resonate with these different people? Well, what is it that's animating them that might help me figure out my next steps and things?
Yeah, I think it's got to be more than just ideas, though. And maybe the thing that's accelerated in this age is our access to unlimited amounts of content. Oh, yeah. And we've become very skillful at being selective about our preferences about that content, and who said what I agree with best, or in the snappiest or most unorthodox way. And I get that, but I think we live in a time where ideas are kind of cheap, and embodiment and relationship are expensive and rare. But I think that those qualities are really integral to formation or transformation of the person.
Oh, no, I agree with you. Like, when for 15 years, I ran confirmation programs at different churches, and almost every congregation has a confirmation program. Success is, one, getting them to finish, because then the parents don't make them get up on Sundays, and two, getting them to know enough things that they can pass whatever kind of assessment that means obviously their baptism stuck. And regardless of the denomination or church or the part of the country, they would be like worksheets about theology, or like, let's visit other spiritual places. And that way we learn the basic tenets of these other religions. What are we learning? Their ideas, right? Like, and all of them had to do with these, like, either histories and ideas. And I got rid of them, very much inspired by the soul graffiti stuff and the experiments in truth you've talked about. And I would get the 16 to 18-year-olds together, and we'd go on the opening spiritual retreat. We'd do the Sermon on the Mount. And then I'd go, we're going to spend the next 6 months doing experiments and teachings of Jesus as we read through one gospel. And every week I had them bring their big God questions they'd come up with, and I'd put them in a bowl, which was the big God bowl. Yeah. And I never answered them. I always ran over. And so by the end of the 6 months, they slowly realized Tripp's actually going to answer 0 theology questions. And you know how much I love answering theology questions. This is not to degrade theology. I just don't think it is like the means by which you identify with the body of Christ today. And they slowly realized we're never going to actually answer them. And we'd spend the time doing the experiments of truth and do a different one together each month. And then by the end, if you were in a community that took the teachings of Jesus seriously, and then you pull out the questions you ask, most of them are dumb, right? Like if you prayed for your enemy for a month, and then you pull out one of those, Mark, do you think that Gandhi goes to heaven? And can Jesus save Hitler? Right? Like you get that. But if you'd actually prayed for your enemy for a month, you're like, I'm optimistic. Right. Yeah. But it's just because if Jesus told us to pray for our enemies, I'm sure Abba's doing at least as good as we are.
Well, and one of the things I would like to read about, but I think a lot about, is that shift from the presumed objective perspective towards a more subjective, experiential perspective on your spiritual longings.
Mm-hmm.
And I think something about our education system has trained us to try to aim for the objective. And no one does this better than white straight males, like you or me, mm-hmm. where we fold our arms and scratch our chins one step removed from life, and cognate and have opinions. And maybe my work is about that because I have a tendency towards that.
Mm-hmm.
And I know the hollowness that I felt in my soul, trying to be the big mind without bringing heart and body into it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think part of that is with the kind of enlightenment kinds of knowing. I mean, there's a number of different ones, but they all kind of are modeled where the knower, the type of epistemology you have, the type of knowing involves distancing. And it's distancing so that the object of knowledge is precisely an object. And if we are physicists, that is the best way of doing it. Mm-hmm. You want the people figuring out vaccines to do it that way. So it's just, if you're talking about the ultimate mystery of existence, or you're talking about love, or how a painting seizes you, or how a mm-hmm. friend that you betrayed forgives you, not the best kind of knowing. And I think that the infatuation with the power of science and the Enlightenment and the type of finality and absoluteness, at least it pretends to give you, mm-hmm. We were so smitten with it as Western Christians that then we wanted to have that type of knowing about our faith. And the thing is, Jesus, that's not what this invitation is to, right? Like, even that question Jesus gives his disciples, it's like, who do they say I am? That's a distanced epistemology.
Yeah.
And they give answers that are completely reasonable. Jesus could have been John the Baptist with his head restitched on. Elijah come back down. He didn't die. Like or what does a historical Jesus scholar say? A cynic wandering sage, or, insert things. And then he says, who do you say I am? And Peter says, your son, son of the living God. You're the Christ, right? And he doesn't go, thanks, Pete. The evidence demanded that verdict. He goes, my heavenly Father revealed that to you. And what does that confession entail? Following and being in the community of people that share. Mm-hmm. That engaged epistemology it is what meant he journeyed with Jesus to even discover the content of the confession. Yes, Jesus is Lord, but what does it mean? You have to live in the way. And that's why I've already texted friends saying, they know I'm like a super Mark Scandrette fan, but I'm really excited about the new book because it takes the Beatitudes and then goes like, this is just the beginning of Jesus's best sermon.
Yeah. Let's experiment with them. Let's try them. Let's try them on and see how they work for us. Dallas Willard was a big influence on me, who was studied Husserl, father mm-hmm. of phenomenology. And I'm not as well versed academically as you, but we're all philosophers in one sense. And I think Husserl's one of his contributions was we participate in the experiment of understanding reality. It's not an armchair exercise. And I think Dallas Willard took that phenomenological approach to the words of Jesus, and that's what shaped his project there.
Mm-hmm. There's this Husserl talks about the way, and phenomenology is studying things as they give themselves, and so often you don't realize the way in which all of our assumptions about something fills in the gaps, right? So you and I've spent enough time with each other, we can imagine the parts of our bodies that are or aren't off screen, and then we're trying to guess, did COVID mean they gained or lost pounds? Or have they changed in the last few years? But we fill in the gaps to each other, or the backside of a cup. You know what another cup,
right?
And And one of the gifts phenomenology does, and Dallas Willard does this with the teachings of Jesus. It says, like, what if you pause for a second and you only attended to what Jesus actually said? And you don't fill in American Christianity that's somehow subservient with a dominant empire today and privileges white supremacy and doesn't ignore or, like insert all those things. And in one sense, we could write screeds that said, hey, church, you're filling in, right, the backside of the vision with horrible, sick shit, and it's going to keep embarrassing you, and no one wants to believe it, and it's not good news. And a few people respond to that type of response. Or you go, the one you call Lord and deeply love. Let us take what he said so seriously, it fills in the rest of reality. And that's what I thought you were doing in the book.
Oh, beautiful. I mean, I start with trying to say there's a story that at the beginning that kind of confronts me with, I think, my Western approach. And it was because I became friends with this Zen Buddhist priest, Shinko, who you might have met along the way at I used to bring him around to some of the events that we were part of. But on one of our first walks, I said, Shinko, I'm not that familiar with faith traditions outside my own. So maybe you can just help me know, when you wake up each day, what do you seek to do and to be? And in about 4 minutes, he could give me the Four Noble Truths. And then he talked about the Eightfold Path. And he said, every day I wake up and I want to deepen my experience of these 8 paths. And I was really impressed with both how clear it was and how concrete. And then he asked me, Mark, you identify as a follower of Jesus. When you wake up each day, what do you seek to do and to be? And first I thought, he's asking me for how I became a Christian. But I realized that's not the question. It's what do I do as one who is on this path? And so I felt like I sort of recovered, and I said, I try and love God with my whole being and love my neighbor as myself. And I sort of patted myself on the back. And I'm like, that actually wasn't the question, or at least the answer I gave was so 30,000 feet. It cannot be operationalized in my life. And it haunted me. So in 2015, when some friends in London asked me to help create some practices around the Beatitudes with this project called 9 Beats, I'm like, it reminded me of that interaction and the haunting. And I was like, I really want to have a better answer to the question, what do I seek to do and to be today, as I follow along in this Jesus way. And, Dr. Willard used to say the Sermon on the Mount is like the curriculum for Christ-likeness. If you wanted to be like him, to see the world as he did, to live in the way that he did, then we'd need to pay careful attention to that. So I think our lack of clarity about how to follow Jesus that seems endemic to our culture isn't because Jesus wasn't specific about it. It's just that we never learned to pay attention to what he was, the invitations he was giving us to life.
So do you think, what are the kind of the major reasons you see people hesitate or sidestep or ignore or avoid even taking the invitation that Jesus gives, throughout all 4 Gospels, rather incessantly? What is it that keeps us from taking it seriously or for what it is?
I think it starts with the assumption that knowing things is the whole game, rather than approaching it with the whole person, like we've talked about. We did a pilot prior to this book. I wrote a guide or a path to the Beatitudes called the Ninefold Path that was published in the UK by 9 Beats. And we were piloting it with young people in the Midlands and in the suburbs of London. And we noticed that the kids who'd been to church tended to want to give theological answers to actually just life questions, and they were much more resistant to actually experiment with the words of Jesus than a kid who'd been raised completely secular, who didn't know any better, than to actually just trust Jesus as a wisdom teacher. So there's something that is like, I think, inoculated us in our formation against taking Jesus at his word and trusting that he might have known what he was talking about.
Yeah.
That it'd be better to live open-handed instead of closed-handed, or it'd be better to face what's hard with lament and complaint than to always escape, or that we could stop comparing ourselves to one another and actually embrace the reality that each of us has equal value and worth. It'd be better to stop living in contempt and look at one another with eyes of compassion. Like, we know, most of us know some of this from experience, but there's this impulse that takes us away from the practical.
So, following you and your family on social media, given all the things we've gone on in the last year and a half, 2 years, you've shared about how, in particular, the kind of facing the realities of police violence against citizens has shown up in your neighborhood. And maybe you could share a bit about that story and how one of the practices that this kind of way of life Jesus invites us to kind of frames what it means to show up as a follower of Jesus in your neighborhood in response to the kind of violence that's there.
Yeah, it actually, I started working on this project just a couple months after a kid on our block was shot and killed by SFPD. Amilcar Perez Lopez was a 20-year-old from the mountains of Guatemala. His parents don't speak very good Spanish because they speak indigenous mountain language there. And we've always heard gunshots, but the night when we heard these shots, I usually wait for the siren, but there was no siren. And so I thought no one got hit. The reason I didn't hear a siren is that the police were the ones who pulled the trigger and they were already there. And they closed down the street, went door to door, seizing cameras and cell phones, telling people not to look outside and telling them they saw nothing. And which was hard for me to believe as a privileged white male. The police have always mostly been good to me, and and are for me. And I went around the block the next morning, and some of my neighbors told me what they actually saw, that they'd seen the police shoot this young man 6 times in the back. And I said, "Are you going to testify? There's an investigation going on." And they said, "That's the last thing I want to do." I had an uncle who disappeared, or a cousin who was shot execution style because he knew too much. And it sort of upended a lot of my preconceived notions about law and order in our society. And I think that, I just felt invited in. And there was a local Episcopal priest who worked for Faith in Action who said, invited me to be part of a press conference and to file a complaint against the police. And we held a year of vigils out in front of the Mission Police Station, and met so many mothers who'd lost their sons in police killings. Often it was mental illness was involved, or a misinterpretation of a situation. And I feel like a couple of the Beatitudes really speak to me about this. One would be, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice." And I think our first tendency is we see these overwhelming problems and we throw up our hands, and we have this learned helplessness. The problems are too big. What can one person do? Or we've tried to engage in issues of suffering and struggle, and it felt like our efforts were frustrated. And what that beatitude points to is something Jesus says later in the Sermon on the Mount. You're the light of the world. Your choices matter. We shape the world by our actions. We're not just pawns in a big cosmic game. We participate in making the world what it can be. And I felt humbled because I realized, and maybe this speaks to, blessed are the meek, for they'll inherit the earth. I think I have learned in my life, or told myself, if it didn't happen to me, it didn't happen. Or if I can't be in charge, then it's not worth participating in. Mm-hmm. And I felt by that beatitude invited into a much greater posture of humility than I'd ever had before. I saw myself as a faith leader. I need to be in charge. And it's like, no, in this situation, I need to bring the sound system and make the chili and open my living room to the people of color and the activists who really know what they're doing. And I'm going to learn from them. And that was a big new step for me in my life and in the life of our family. And we'd come to this neighborhood to try and be good neighbors. And I'm a little embarrassed that for 15 years, because of my power perspective, I couldn't really join into the community. And so that experience changed all that. We're much more connected to our neighbors now, and much, much more connected to community.
Mm-hmm. And I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think that oftentimes the Beatitudes get, I don't know, turned into greeting cards, in ways that they are blessings for the people that aren't doing as good as you. Mm-hmm. That you're like, well, Jesus is going to talk to me in chapter 6 of Matthew. Chapter 5 for the people not doing that well. Mm-hmm. First, you got the ones doing bad, and then you got the second half of 5 are the people that aren't real Christians. They're backsliders. Then it gets to the good stuff, And one of the things I loved about the book is how there's a double movement in each one. So it begins with the way of trust. And so you own your poverty, and then you live with open hands. With lament, you face your pain and you wait for comfort. When you think of how that double movement is there, and Jesus frames it as blessing, what is getting itself done in Jesus beginning, his most popular sermon, with a stack of blessings that involve these kind of participatory movements?
Yeah, I think there's a simple message there, and then maybe a more complex one. Mm-hmm. The first is Jesus is calling unlikely people blessed, right? And I think that's how we often interpret it. Makarios is the word in Greek, and it means something like, this person really has it going on. It's like the kind of honorific that we would give to our favorite celebrity or athlete or a billionaire, a tech person that is enviable in some way. What
about ones with spaceships?
Yeah, well, okay. I think we've turned the corner, and there's less envy and more contempt towards billionaires now than there was 5 years ago or whatever.
We're making progress. All right.
Yeah. After rigged elections and a few things like that,
Well, nothing will bring them back around like giant phalluses flying to space.
One of them actually built a giant phallus in my city. I don't know if you've seen this picture of the skyline in San Francisco. There's a Salesforce tower that dominates the entire skyline now. Just a great big. But so anyway, I think the first take is, wow, Jesus is saying unlikely people are blessed, or that it's not just the powerful and the privileged, that God's life can come to any of us, whatever your story, whatever your struggle, whatever situation you find yourself in. And I think that's good news, because if we're really honest, all of us have these places of challenge and difficulty in our lives, things that don't measure up or work out, disappointments that we have. But I don't think that point needed 9 statements to make. Jesus could have just said, the kingdom's upside down and unlikely people are welcome and included. So I think he may have also been naming areas of struggle that is part of the human condition that we all experience, and saying, what I'm about to tell you in this message is going to connect with your lived experience of feeling like you don't have enough, of being overwhelmed by your own pain or the pain in the world, by the fatigue of being in competition and comparison. And so I can show you a better way. And so my assumption is that Jesus had full access to reality and lived and spoke from that. But we have a distorted perception of reality that brings misery to our lives. So part of what's going on in the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus helping us return to what's most real. And the first thing he has to do, though, is name the distortion. So I think there's 9 areas of distortion that is in our human experience. And Jesus is saying, like, wrestle with this, like, name this for yourself, explore this. And then I'm going to show you a new way of seeing who you are, who God is, and how life works that's more accurate to reality. And if you can get that, you'll easily forgive, love your neighbor, stop judging, love your enemies, live generously. If you could live in reality, if you could see the world as I see it, these things would be easy for you to do. And so it's an invitation into 9 new postures for life.
Oh, I think you do a great job doing it. So I just know, like, my natural, cynical, critical self would hear you say that and then think it's like a trailer of a movie where only the funny parts are in the trailer. There's nothing else there, but the book is really, really good. And some of it are invitations into doing things, even like, and people can go check it out on YouTube. That YouTube series you did, where these movements include even postures to think about for you to do for yourself, and using your body to help form the way you're forming your soul in that moment. And you can use them with communities. Anyway, I think that in some sense, or like a minimal statement Christians make about Jesus is, he has access to reality in a deep way that he not only participates in, but makes possible for those that follow after him. Right. And that the gift of grace is that the possibilities of God are available to us that are not of our own making. Mm-hmm. And yet so often, we do that kind of activity of disengagement. And so it's like you refuse to eat the meal because you looked at the menu and decided the descriptions weren't good enough or whatever. And I feel like part of what you're describing is that it's like my grandmother used to say, like, well, the proof of the pudding is how it tastes. Mm-hmm. Like the proof is in the pudding, but no, it's actually how it tastes. Like, you eat it. And so much of the distrust and anger because of the church's infidelity, allegiance to nationalism, white supremacy, economism, all these type of things, creating space to preserve people that violate boundaries in hurtful ways and stuff like that, means that there's like all this distaste that then we don't know what to do. And so we want to fix it cognitively. And the beautiful thing of this is, like, Jesus invites us to access that reality, and it doesn't have to be mediated by an institution, an aristocracy, a patriarchy, but it's actually, it's a community of practice, and it can be in all sorts of different ways. And that tasting of the pudding image to me is really helpful, because it's not always just the burdens that we have from our experience. It's also sometimes the God question or those type of things, right? Like where you're like, I'm interested, I'm a seeker. I don't even know if I know if there's a God. And yet if you have to figure out the proofs for God existence, yay or nay, in order to possibly go into a cathedral and experience worship or go into a basement and pray with your friends, then you perpetually defer the very place you eat the meal. And so I feel like there's twofold. Like, do you see that or a connection between the two, that yes, there's the invitation to practice helps for those who are hung up on the ideas of toxicity and past experiences, but it's also a way to listen to the wisdom of a tradition, even if you aren't sure about its bigger claims about the divine.
Yeah. And going way back, we had people in our local faith community who were in deconstruction. And I'd say, why don't you just let's put your big questions to the side for a little bit and take Jesus at face value and just see, test by experience, do the things that he invites us into help make our lives better or not? Like, is he trustworthy? And the only way to know that is by trying on the kinds of things that he invites us into. So would I have the courage to sit with what's hard instead of running from it, to stop numbing out and spend some time in silence and solitude and wait for a deeper sense of presence, comfort, and solace in the places of sadness in my life? Would I have the courage to try that and see what would happen? Or, yeah, I think part of this, and part of this shift of perspective for me too, is I think it's easy to look at the world or the church and go, that's what's wrong. And I think these distortions of reality that we live in are responsible for the systemic and structural things that we find problematic.
Yeah.
But I also have the assumption that whatever's broken about the world is also broken inside of me. And so if we're going to see the systems change, that me and the system have to change. And maybe the first place to look is to be honest with myself. I can be upset by the greediness of a capitalist economy, but I know the hunger for more, bigger, and better that's in my heart that animates some of my behavior, right? And so how would like a first step is for me to admit that I live with a close-handedness and a desperation and a greediness that doesn't feel whole and it doesn't feel like life. How could I learn to live with more freedom and lightness and open-handedness?
Yeah, I don't know if I've told you this one, but one of the last groups I did, because the youth ones went so well, that then parents were like, can I get confirmed? There's a lot of the ones that you were on family retreat for when you and Lisa led our church family retreat. And I was like, I guess. And in my head, I'm like, I'm not sure their parents are that Christian that they're going to get uncomfortable when they find out that what happens, so anyway, and I did something similar, but modified the schedule for people with jobs and teenagers. But when we did the Sermon on the Mount thing, and then I'm like, which of the lines from do you want us to come up with an experiment? And they, like their kids, picked the do not judge.
Yeah.
Very popular one, especially if you think most of the people around you are judging you all the time,
Yeah.
And so what we did with which I've done this with teenagers, set up a text group of everyone in the group. And all you do is, if you judge someone, just text the first name or initials. If you can lie too, if you need the Holy Ghost to translate. But like, I would text Mark and I'd be like, Jamie. And then everyone in the group gets it. And when they get it, you just have to do a short prayer. Like, God, you made and know and love Jamie. Give Tripp the eyes to see Jamie as you see her, and the courage to love her as you intend her to be loved. That's it. Right. And so you're doing it for a month. Week 3, someone eventually texts their own name.
Wow.
So Tripp texts Tripp, and then Mark sees it. And it's like, Tripp texts Tripp. God, you made and know and love Tripp completely. Give Tripp the eyes to see Tripp. as you intend them to be loved, and the courage to love him. Like you do the prayer again. And teenagers, once someone texts themselves, everybody else starts texting themselves. And you realize, like, where does judgment come from? The fact that all of us walk around seeing the problem in us.
Yeah.
First time an adult texts their name, everyone goes to chat for the rest of the week. You come in the group and everyone's like, are we going to talk about this? And then I go, I just want you all to know, here's what happens when your kids did this. Right. But the conversation was similar because all of us live in a world where there is all this hatred and judgment. And the one we see the biggest problems in is ourself. Yeah. We can't see it. It gets spewed out on other people. Mm-hmm. And then we celebrate each other, pointing it out about other people. And it covers over the fact that none of us know we're lovable. And then there's like sitting there in this one teaching we think protects us, right, from other people's judgments.
Right.
That it actually means that we're blanketing in our own self-judgment. And what happens if we were to recognize the most true thing about us is you're God's beloved. It's true about you. And when you get it, it can be true about your enemy. Mm-hmm. And I like when you get done with something like that, right? Like where in week 4, people are actually texting their own names, knowing they're in a community that allows that honesty. When you get done, if that's not closer to what reality should be, then I don't even want reality. And it's not because like, you've gone through some proofs about the divinity of Jesus or whatever, but what's required for that to be true? Mm-hmm. And what would even make it possible is a community of people doing it. And people regularly are shocked to find out that the theologian doesn't do a lot of theologizing in his confirmation class. I just think that's really important to get. It's hard to do on the internet, but
we try. I've been during COVID, I've been leading these Ninefold Path groups online. We're actually starting a couple next week, and we end up being able to have, I think, some pretty powerful experiences. We meet 2 hours a week, and then we share journal entries and take on a daily habit like the one you just mentioned, and then do some kind of threshold experiment, and then come back the next week, get in small groups and tell the stories of that.
What's a threshold experiment?
Some new action you take in response to this beatitude invitation. Like the first 2 are kind of prescribed, and then when we get to the experiment, it's like, what do you feel invited to do? How would this play out in your context? Come up with an experiment for yourself, try something new. If you've been judging and talking bad about Muslims, go, connect with somebody and have a meal with them, whatever it might, that would be an example of that. Mm-hmm. But you've been talking about, I call the way of compassion, and where Jesus talks about this in Beatitudes, blessed are the merciful, for they'll be shown mercy. So I want to use this to kind of walk through some of the kind of handles on this, mm-hmm. to get from the beatitude to maybe the practice that you mentioned. So our first instinct is to make moral evaluations. We started doing this when we were kids. Tripp, do you remember saying, like, who's the good guy and who's the bad guy in the movie?
Yes.
And you want the good guy to have a good outcome and the bad guy to get what they deserve. This whole redemptive violence thing.
Yeah. If you find out the bad guy's actually the good guy's dad, it really blows your mind.
Yeah.
If he's got a laser sword, it's even crazier.
So that shows a young mind trying to understand the difference between right and wrong. It's how we develop our moral compass. But that judging that evaluating can quickly go into contempt. And we tend to feel that towards other people, but as you've noted, we often do it to ourselves. And psychologists like Gilligan and Fowler talked about these moral stages of development, that we tend to go, am I a good boy or a bad boy? a good girl or a bad girl. And so there's this first instinct towards judgment that quickly becomes toxic. And so Jesus' invitation is learn to see yourself and others as beloved, that the truest thing about you is not your mistakes and failures. It's that you're connected to the source of all of life. You're precious. Someone delights in you. And we'll actually get people to try and experience this by taking on a posture of looking through the shape of a heart with their hands. We even do it online. I'm doing it towards you right now as we look at each other. And remember who you're looking at. Someone who's precious and beloved. When we can do this in person, people will look into another human being's eyes who is looking at them in that tender way. And often people break down and start crying because it's not just an idea of belovedness, but a bodily experience of being seen as precious. And so, the invitation then is to learn to make a habit of looking with compassion rather than contempt. Mm-hmm. And your experiment was a perfect example of like ways to do this. Another one I do sometimes is, and we suggest in the book, is making a commitment to practice positive speech. So for a week, we promise not to say anything negative or critical about anyone, including ourselves. And one of the last times I did this, I broke the promise 3 times in the first 3 hours after I made it. But that's kind of the point, to show you, to show myself how often contempt permeates how I think and feel. Like it dominates. And and same with your texting example there, is that it brings something that was in the unconscious into the conscious. And when it's in the conscious, we can make willful choices about whether we want to encourage it or not. And so it's not about perfection or like, oh, I didn't judge anybody this week. It's more about how many times did I turn from contempt to seeing as God sees. And that's I think what's transforming.
Oh yeah. Oh, so for people that hear this and then say, I wish I had people in my community to do this. Like, what kind of advice do you have for people wanting to either kind of invite their friends they do have into something like this, or to start intentional friendships or community that makes space for testing these type of experiments?
Yeah, I think I hear from a lot of people that say, I wish for a more practical, embodied, and wholehearted community. Mm-hmm. I don't know if anybody else is interested. And I usually encourage people to say, if you put yourself out there and invite a couple other people to try on some experiments or practice with you, you might be surprised. But what I do think it also requires, and I highlight this in my book, Practicing the Way of Jesus, is a change in contract. Most of our relationships, and including kind of faith relationships or spiritual community relationships, are based on a implicit contract of what we do together. Like your average small group has a contract like, we're going to be warm bodies in a room, and we're going to talk about ideas and eat food. And maybe we're going to share a little bit about what's hard in our lives and pray for each other if it's the praying type of group. But that's different than a community of practice. I think, and so I really advocate for making the shift in contract explicit, to say, this is a community, or for the next 6 weeks at least, we want to bring our whole selves and be authentic and keep confidences, make this a safe space to be real. We're going to not just entertain ideas, but we're going to by the end of each meeting, make a commitment to take on some practice together. And then we're going to, when we come back together, reflect on our experience, interrogate it, share authentically about the shifts we noticed in our hearts and minds and relationships as a result of the practice. And I think that is a recipe for beginning to create a different kind of community, and try it and see who says yes. We also created some resources to help with that. I'd like to think that the Ninefold Path of Jesus book is a good tool. And then the lab we developed, which is available from 9 Beats in London. It's at a website called ninefoldpath.org. I went like a mad scientist for a couple of years to try and bake into this path, the wisdom I've learned about holding that space over the last 15 years, so that I hope someone could pick that up. But I also say, my main work right now is training leaders in how to hold that space. Mm-hmm. And so a couple times a year, I invite leaders or people who want to lead a group to do a 10-week experience with me online, where I model this kind of space. And then we give you the curriculum afterwards to try it out with a group. And we actually do a master class on it. And it's based on a doctoral course I teach at Fuller about how to hold that kind of transformational space too.
Mm-hmm. Recently, I read this book. I mean, it's super nerdy, but I thought this is like the nerd version of Mark Scandrette. This book right here is called Spiritual Exercises for a Secular Age. It's written by a Jesuit who it sees philosophy as the invitation to think about the good life, and then the Ignatian path as a Jesuit as a series of community practices to forming one's life. And, in one of the appendices, you bring up this stuff. And he gave 2 images in the book that I was just like, I just want to tell Mark these because he doesn't preach them, but Mark could. One, he said, a lot of people think that following Jesus, because of the way the church has privileged certain voices, is like finally a real disciple, someone that wins a reality show and becomes a famous singer, when successful discipleship is having the greatest karaoke night of your life.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, you can't. That's such a good. He's like, because what is successful karaoke? The ability to humiliate yourself for the well-being and enjoyment of the whole.
Yeah.
And to give it all your gusto because everyone already knows.
Yeah.
Like, you don't have access to full reality. You aren't Jesus freaking Christ, but you're going to give it your heart. You're going to do your best, and you're going to fail. Like, you're not Adele. It's okay. But you can still roll with some of the deep.
Yeah.
And that's such a good image. I want to hear the version Mark Scandrette. And then he found this passage where he said that a lot of people see discipleship as high points, success on some story that they're working. And they don't recognize that discipleship's not a destination you eventually get to. It's an invitation to pilgrimage, and pilgrimage involves walking with a different intentionality. And then he does this quote, which next to it in there, I said, boom, MS, which is Mark Scandrette. I'm not going to tell which of all my friends I put their initials in books to tell them this quote, but I've been saving this. So pretend you like it. All right.
Yeah. No, I'm eating it up.
All right. A pilgrimage is a journey undertaken in light of a story. A great events happen. The pilgrim hears the reports and goes in search of the evidence, aspiring to be an eyewitness. The pilgrim seeks not only to confirm the experience of others firsthand, but to be changed by the experience. Pilgrims often make the journey in company, but each must be changed individually. They must see for themselves, each with his or her own eyes. And as they return to ordinary life, the pilgrims must tell others what they saw, recasting the story in their own terms. And I think your book is an invitation to practicing the pilgrimage of the deep reality that Jesus gives. But the task isn't just to go, Jesus was right. It's to recast that story in our own lives, in the communities we're in, and then invite people into it. And it's only when that happens that journey becomes a sacred one. Otherwise, it's like the Roman road or whatever version of deflated narrative we give.
You said that so beautifully, Tripp. And what I love about being in these Ninefold Path groups is what I learn from everybody who's participating, everybody who's being wholehearted in the space, everyone who takes on a practice. We have this kind of embodied collective knowledge together that we're gaining, or maybe wisdom's a better practical wisdom that we're gaining as we're in that lab environment together. And something I've always appreciated about it is you're obviously wicked smart, but you ground it in relationship and in practice and reality. Like, you're not content just cognating, but you're on the journey, you're on the pilgrimage.
Well, I mean, you've been in a really important part of that for me, for a long time, both in books and in friendship. And then getting to meet your whole family, which I hope Alicia and I do almost as good a job as you and Lisa at being parents and passing on the things you love deeply. Okay, so I have 3 completely unrelated questions.
Yeah.
And based on how much time you have, you can decide how long you answer them.
All right.
But 2 were sent in. 1 is just one I wanted to ask.
Okay, let me just say first, you're looking more like Keith Green than I've ever seen you look before.
Oh. We
like
know
something
why?
About those curls, the length of your hair.
Wow.
It looks awesome.
It's because you put this joy in my heart. And I always wanted to be Larry Norman. My hair's too thick and curly. So
too curly.
Yeah. So when one of the things a lot of people are commenting on in lockdown are people not going back to their jobs. There's recent survey on even people that could go to college if they were down for large amounts of debt, not going. And I think that underneath lockdown meant a lot of people were forced out of this ugly system that you previously wrote a book with Lisa about getting free from. The kind of economic success, drive growth nonstop. The only way you can be stable is to always be growing mode. For those who were out of that and said, I'm surprised the pandemic might be the most free moment I've had. And like, what does that mean about what I've been chasing and giving myself to? Like, how would you process that? And I recognize this is different than those who are essential workers and crapped upon by how we responded and are still being treated poorly because we haven't fully responded the best way we can in lots of ways. But so many people I know listening to the podcast during lockdown, I've done a lot of these groups, are like, I was doing this. This is BS. I don't know what I'm doing, but this can't be the best we can do. Like, where do you begin when you're having those places to begin to question the kind of normative assumptions that are about reality?
Yeah. I mean, I feel that myself, like the COVID's put limits on how much I can travel and how much I can accomplish. And there was a moment in there of really getting in contact with what's really meaningful and valuable. Presence, relationships, the simple pleasures of life. And then I noticed other times during this pandemic of just numbing out. Like, I don't think I'm taking advantage of the invitation and the great pause. And I'm just itching to get back to my normal. And I think maybe missing the invitation. But, I think many of us would find that having more time and less financial obligation, we would find more rest for our souls. And so I'd encourage people to keep leaning into that and to notice when you're amping up again or adopting again those more, bigger, better values. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I during COVID, I had somebody that I was coaching, because I do quite a bit of, I call it spiritual coaching. It's a cross between spiritual direction and life coaching. And he said, I'm scared to ask these big questions of meaning, because I think if I did, it would wreck my career trajectory. And so I'm right on the edge of being willing to ask those questions, and you can feel the tension. Like if we lean into it, we're probably going to get some wisdom that would lead us away from some of our normal patterns.
Mm-hmm. So one of the questions, a podcast of the community members message when I said I was talking to you, was to ask you how you do with the growing animosity you have with the tribe you're born in. And he said, I used to be able to make sense of evangelicals, but they've the kind of, Trump style ones they grew up in. But he said the anger is getting more and more frustrating, and their commitment, the plausible deniability I can give them around big issues is just out the window. And I now have a hard time, like, I can love a lot of enemies, but not half my family, was the line. And like, what do you do with that?
Well, that's the real dojo for following the Jesus way is learning to love the enemies that are close to you. Mm-hmm. And I can definitely relate, because I have members of my family who, are conspiracy theorists and think, that their Christianity is tied up in white supremacy and militarism and consumerism. And I think the good thing about this era is it's very clear that the kind of perspective and character Jesus invites us into is very different than that sort of rhetoric, in a way that is quite stark. But I have felt invited, particularly over the last 4 or 5 years, to not just listen to what people say, but from the heart motive that it comes from. And I think, a lot of us operate out of fear and out of judgment. And when we're afraid, we say certain things and we cling to certain ideas or institutions. And so I'm slowly learning to pay attention to the heart of the person and not just what they say. I also think that some people live better than their ideas. Mm-hmm. Some of my relatives live and love better than their theology. I probably live less than my ideas. I'm an asshole sometimes. I'm not very loving. I'm not very patient. So the problem is a lack of formation, not a lack of good access to ideas about this stuff. So to have some humility about that is helpful for me too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think it's definitely a challenge, and I get it. And there are more and more churches where those distinctions, because of the polarization outside, it now determines more of what takes place on the inside. And because those are the dominating things on a lot of people's digitally mm-hmm. mediated and algorithmically tuned for your anger and anxiety screens, those are then the questions you carry first into encounters with your neighbor and your family mm-hmm. and the people in your community, your spiritual community. And I just think that's, yes, those questions and challenges are important, but also, Jesus was never lacked clarity on what mattered most about the transformation of material reality, but he was able to be clear about that and at the same time honor the dignity of those mm-hmm. who shunned him and killed him. And whatever that space is, I would like to eventually get there, because I definitely am not there. And I know the things earlier today, I was talking with our friend Brian McLaren, and he joked, because if I was going to saint someone, like he's like on like near like high quality, nice person. I was like, I've seen you in enough of situations where people were really horrible to you that you actually are nice. Like you couldn't be faking it this well. And he goes, Trip, but sometimes things go through my head. And I'm like, if I just could keep them in my head.
Right.
And he said, well, Trip, I'm uncomfortable being tipsy, so I don't tweet at night. And I was like, well, but I do think there, like there is that, the model of Jesus is the only way I could figure out how to negotiating those two, because we don't want to, like, we've seen what happens when we aren't clear about injustice. But we also see how horrible responses are if you engage people by shaming them, critiquing them, or ditching them and letting them know why you're leaving. And neither one of those are effective tools.
Yep, totally agree.
I'll ask you one last question, and it is, what was your main distraction in lockdown? Like, was there a TV show, a movie, a book, a board game, something that you discovered that you're like, me or my family, we're into this?
Yeah, it was definitely a series of comedy shows. Schitt's Creek. There's another very obscure Canadian one. Oh man, I'm not going to get the name of it. Kim's Convenience. That's not the one, but Letterkenny.
Oh, I haven't seen that.
Not for the faint of heart. It's Shakespearean in scope. Please Like Me, out of Australia. And this is an oldie but a goodie, because I spent time in Australia. Kath and Kim. You cannot beat it. It's hilarious.
Well, that's good. That's good. See, I have new recommendations. Thank you for hanging out. And I'm eagerly anticipating when we see each other in person and I can give you an awkwardly long hug.
Likewise.
All right.
Love you to pieces.
Smoochy boochies.
You and your family.
Okay. Tell the rest. Hi.
All right.
All right.
Peace.
Bye.
Bye-bye.